I was sitting on my back porch in Scottsdale, Arizona, enjoying my morning coffee when I noticed someone rifling through my propane shed, and my blood immediately ran cold because I knew exactly who it was. Linda Morrison, the president of our homeowners association, stood halfway inside my locked shed with a crowbar in one hand and her phone in the other, taking pictures of God knows what. The morning sun caught her perfectly coiffed blonde hair as she leaned further into the structure I'd built myself 2 months ago. My name is Lucas Matthews, and I'd lived in the Saguaro Heights subdivision for 3 years without major incident, until Linda took over as HOA president 6 months ago. Since then, my life had become a bureaucratic nightmare of violations, fines, and threatening letters about everything from my mailbox being the wrong shade of black to my grass being a 1/4 inch too tall. I set my coffee down slowly, pulled out my phone, and started recording. My hands shook slightly as I zoomed in on her clear violation of my property rights. The shed sat about 15 feet from my back fence, well within my property line, and I'd made absolutely certain of that before building it. I'd even had a surveyor come out to mark everything clearly because I knew Linda would look for any excuse to cause trouble. "Linda," I called out, my voice echoing across my yard. "What the hell are you doing?" She jerked upright so fast she nearly hit her head on the shed's roof. The crowbar clattered to the ground as she spun around, her face cycling through surprise, embarrassment, and then that familiar entitled anger I'd come to recognize. "Lucas Matthews, this structure is not in compliance with HOA regulations," she announced, smoothing down her pastel blue blazer as if she hadn't just been caught breaking and entering. "I have every right to inspect properties for violations." "You broke into my locked shed," I said, keeping my phone steady and recording every second. "That's called trespassing. That's called breaking and entering. That's called a crime, Linda." Her face flushed red, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "The HOA covenants clearly state that the board has the authority to inspect any structure on the property to ensure compliance. I sent you a notice 3 days ago about this inspection. You sent me a notice that you wanted to inspect my shed. I responded in writing that you could schedule an appointment and I'd be happy to show you around. You don't get to just break in whenever you feel like it." I walked closer, still filming. "And you definitely don't get to damage my property. That lock you pried off cost me $60. Linda bent down and picked up the crowbar, and for a second, I wondered if she was actually unhinged enough to threaten me with it. Instead, she pointed it at the shed like a teacher pointing at a chalkboard. "This structure exceeds the height limitation by 18 inches. It's also not the approved color according to the architectural guidelines. Furthermore, storing propane tanks in a residential area without proper permits is a fire hazard and a violation of Section 4.7 of our covenants. The structure is exactly 10 feet tall, which is well within the limits for auxiliary buildings according to Arizona state law and our subdivision rules. It's painted gray, which is literally one of the 5 approved colors listed in the architectural guidelines I have sitting on my kitchen counter. And I have all the proper permits for propane storage from both the city and the county, which you'd know if you'd bothered to accept my invitation for a scheduled inspection instead of breaking into my property like a common criminal." A vein pulsed in her temple. "I am not a criminal. I am the president of this homeowners association, and I have a responsibility to maintain property values and ensure compliance. You're a trespasser who just committed property damage, and I have it all on video." I gestured with my phone. "Now get off my property before I call the police." "You wouldn't dare." But uncertainty flickered across her face for the first time. "Try me." We stood there in a standoff, the Arizona morning sun climbing higher and making her squint. Finally, she dropped the crowbar on the ground and marched past me with her nose in the air. "You'll be hearing from the HOA attorney about all these violations. The fines will be substantial." I watched her storm across my yard, through the side gate that she'd apparently also jimmied open, and around to the front where her white Mercedes SUV sat parked half on my driveway and half on my lawn, leaving tire tracks in the grass. She peeled out like a teenager who'd just gotten their license. My hands were still shaking as I stopped the recording and immediately backed it up to my cloud storage. Then I called my insurance company to report the property damage, followed by a call to the non-emergency police line to file a report. The dispatcher sounded almost bored until I mentioned it was an HOA president who'd done it, and then she perked up. "Oh boy, another one," she said with a sigh. "We've had 4 calls about HOA disputes this week alone. An officer will be out within the hour to take your statement." While I waited, I examined the damage. The lock was completely destroyed, pried right off with enough force that part of the door frame had splintered. The crowbar she'd left behind was actually a nice one, probably $50 from a hardware store, with her initials engraved on the handle. LM for Linda Morrison. I almost laughed. She'd literally left a personalized murder weapon at the crime scene, metaphorically speaking. Officer Jake Patterson arrived 45 minutes later, a weathered guy in his 50s who looked like he'd seen everything twice. He examined the shed, took photos, watched my video recording 3 times and shook his head. "This is pretty cut and dry," he said, filling out his report on a tablet. "Breaking and entering, criminal trespassing, property damage. The video evidence is solid. You want to press charges?" "Absolutely," he nodded approvingly. "Good. Too many people let HOAs walk all over them. I live in an HOA myself, and if someone pulled this on me, I'd do the same thing. You might want to get a lawyer too, because she's probably going to come at you hard with fines and legal threats." "I've been thinking about that. I know a guy," Officer Patterson said. "Robert Chen. He specializes in HOA disputes, property law, that kind of thing. Helped my cousin when their HOA tried to foreclose over a dispute about fence height. Guy's a bulldog." He wrote down the name and number on the back of his card and handed it to me. After he left with his report and Linda's engraved crowbar as evidence, I sat on my porch and stared at the number for a long time. Lawyers were expensive, and I wasn't made of money. I worked as a project manager for a construction company, made decent money, but legal fees could drain my savings fast. Then my phone buzzed with an email. It was from the HOA, sent from Linda's personal email address, not even the official HOA one. The subject line read, "Immediate violation notice and fine assessment." I opened it and felt my blood pressure spike. She was fining me $2,000 for the illegal structure, another $500 for unapproved modifications to property, and another $1,000 for refusing to allow HOA inspection of violations. The email stated that if I didn't pay within 10 days, they'd put a lien on my property and begin foreclosure proceedings. I called Robert Chen immediately. His secretary answered and put me through after I explained the situation. Robert had a calm, measured voice that immediately put me at ease despite my racing heart. "Mr. Matthews, Officer Patterson just called me about your situation. He thought you might reach out. Can you email me that video and any correspondence you've had with the HOA?" I sent everything while we were still on the phone. I included the email from 3 days ago where Linda had demanded access to inspect my shed, my polite response offering to schedule an appointment, her lack of response, and then the violation notice she'd just sent. Okay, Robert said after a few minutes of silence while he reviewed everything. This is actually quite straightforward from a legal perspective, though it's going to be unpleasant. First, do not pay those fines. They're completely baseless, and paying them could be construed as admitting fault. Second, I'm going to send Miss Morrison a letter today informing her that she's facing a lawsuit for trespassing, breaking and entering, property damage, and harassment. Third, we're going to file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate because HOAs fall under their oversight, and this is a clear abuse of authority. How much is this going to cost me? I asked, wincing preemptively. My initial retainer is $1,500, and we'll see how things progress from there. But here's the thing, Mr. Matthews. In cases like this, where the HOA board member has so clearly overstepped and committed actual crimes, we can usually recover attorney's fees and damages. The video you took was smart. Very smart. That's going to make this case extremely strong. It was still a lot of money up front, but the alternative was paying $3,500 in bogus fines and probably dealing with more harassment. I gave him my credit card information and officially retained him as my attorney. One more thing, Robert said. Don't engage with Miss Morrison directly anymore. All communication goes through me now. If she shows up at your property again, call the police immediately. Don't talk to her, don't argue, just call 911. For the rest of that day, I felt like I was walking around in a fog. I'd lived a pretty quiet life. I paid my bills, went to work, came home, grilled steaks on the weekend, watched football. Now, I was involved in a legal dispute with criminal charges and potential lawsuits. It felt surreal. The next morning, I was getting ready for work when my doorbell rang. I checked the security camera I'd installed on my front porch last year and saw two people I didn't recognize. A man in his 60s with silver hair and a woman about the same age wearing a concerned expression. I opened the door cautiously. "Can I help you? Are you Lucas Matthews?" the man asked. "Who's asking?" "I'm Donald Ferguson, and this is my wife Patricia. We live 2 streets over. We heard about what happened with Linda Morrison and your shed, and we wanted to talk to you." I hesitated, then stepped aside to let them in. We sat in my living room, and Patricia immediately leaned forward with an intense look. "Linda Morrison has been terrorizing this neighborhood for months," she said. "She's fined us twice for absolutely nothing. Once because our holiday lights were up 3 days past the arbitrary deadline she set, and once because she claimed our mailbox was dented, which it wasn't. We paid both fines because we didn't know what else to do," Donald added. "But when we heard that you're actually fighting back and that she broke into your property, we realized this has gone way too far." "How did you hear about it?" I asked. "Police reports are public record, and we have a friend who works at the station," Patricia explained. "Plus, Linda's been calling an emergency HOA meeting for tonight to discuss your violations. The notice went out yesterday evening." I hadn't received any notice, but that didn't surprise me. "She's probably going to try to get the board to back her up on these bogus fines. The board is basically her puppet show," Donald said bitterly. "She appointed 2 of her friends after the previous board members resigned in frustration. The only other member, Steve Harrison, tries to push back, but he's outvoted on everything. Look, I appreciate you coming by, but I'm not sure what I can do," I said. "I've hired a lawyer and we're dealing with this through legal channels." Patricia and Donald exchanged glances. "We want to hire your lawyer too," Patricia said. "And we know at least 6 other homeowners who'd be interested. If we all band together, maybe we can finally stop her." That evening, I sat in my home office on a Zoom call with Robert Chen, the Fergusons, and 4 other homeowners from the neighborhood. Robert listened as each person detailed their experiences with Linda Morrison. Tom Anderson had been fined $1,000 because his daughter's birthday party balloons were allegedly too commercial-looking and violated the aesthetic standards. Maria Gonzalez had received a violation notice because her vegetable garden was supposedly not an approved landscaping choice, even though nothing in the covenants prohibited gardens. Steve Harrison, the board member who tried to oppose Linda, had been personally fined $1,500 for speaking against her at a board meeting, which she claimed was disrupting HOA business. The stories went on, each one more absurd than the last. Robert took notes and nodded thoughtfully. "What we have here is a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority," he said when everyone had finished. "Arizona has specific laws about HOA governance, and Miss Morrison is violating multiple statutes. Here's what I recommend. We file a class action lawsuit against both Linda Morrison personally and the HOA as an entity. We sue for harassment, violation of property rights, abuse of authority, and breach of fiduciary duty. Mr. Matthews's case with the trespassing and property damage is the strongest, but all of your cases together paint a picture of systemic abuse." "What about the meeting tonight?" Maria asked. "She's going to try to railroad Lucas." "I'll be attending that meeting," Robert said with a slight smile. "As Mr. Matthews's legal representative, I have the right to speak on his behalf, and I think it's time Miss Morrison learned that her actions have consequences." The HOA meeting was held at the community center at 7 p.m. I arrived with Robert at 6:45 to find the parking lot already half full. Apparently, word had spread, and people were curious about the drama. Linda sat at the front table with her two board allies, Barbara Klein and Susan Wright, both women in their 50s who looked like they'd been cut from the same cloth as Linda. Steve Harrison sat slightly apart from them, looking uncomfortable. Linda's face went pale when she saw Robert and me walk in together. We took seats in the front row. The Fergusons, Maria, Tom, and about 20 other residents filled in the other seats. The room buzzed with conversation until Linda banged her gavel at exactly 7. "This meeting will come to order," she announced, her voice tight. "We have several items on the agenda, but first we need to address a serious violation at 4725 Mesquite Drive. That was my address. Here we go. Mr. Lucas Matthews has erected an illegal structure on his property without proper approval from the Architectural Review Committee. Furthermore, he has refused to allow the HOA to conduct a proper inspection of this violation. The board has assessed fines totaling $3,500, and if Mr. Matthews does not comply within 10 days, we will proceed with placing a lien on his property." Robert stood up smoothly. "May I speak?" Linda's jaw clenched. "Who are you?" "Robert Chen, attorney at law. I represent Mr. Matthews in this matter, and I'd like to address several factual inaccuracies in your statement." "This is an HOA meeting, not a courtroom," Barbara Klein interjected. "That's correct, Miss Klein, but HOA meetings are subject to Arizona law, and residents have the right to legal representation when facing fines or sanctions. Now, shall I proceed, or would you prefer I file a complaint about being denied due process?" Linda waved her hand irritably. "Fine. Say what you need to say." Robert pulled out a folder and began methodically. "First, the structure in question is not illegal. Mr. Matthews obtained all required permits from both the city of Scottsdale and Maricopa County before construction began. I have copies of those permits here. Second, the structure complies with all architectural guidelines as specified in the HOA covenants. It is 10 feet in height, well within the 12-foot maximum for auxiliary structures. It is painted gray, color code approved in Section 8.3 of your own architectural guidelines. Third, Mr. Matthews did not refuse inspection. He responded to your request within 24 hours, offering to schedule a mutually convenient time. You never responded to his offer. He paused and pulled out another document. However, the most serious issue is that Miss Morrison, rather than following proper procedures, instead broke into Mr. Matthews's locked shed, causing approximately $300 in property damage. I have video evidence of this trespass, and Mr. Matthews has filed criminal charges. As of this morning, there is an active police investigation into Miss Morrison's actions. The room erupted in murmurs. Linda shot to her feet. That's a lie. I was conducting an official HOA inspection, with a crowbar, Robert asked mildly, on a locked structure, without the owner present or providing consent. Miss Morrison, that's called breaking and entering. It's a Class 6 felony in Arizona if charged as a felony, or a Class 1 misdemeanor at minimum. The fact that you claim you were acting in your capacity as HOA president actually makes it worse, because it shows abuse of authority. This is ridiculous, Susan Wright said, but she looked nervous. The board has the right to inspect properties. With proper notice and with the owner's permission, yes, or with a court order. You don't get to just break down doors because someone didn't respond fast enough to your demands. That's not how the law works. Robert walked up to the board table and laid out several documents. These are copies of the criminal complaint filed with the Scottsdale Police Department, the video evidence, and photographs of the damage. I'm also filing a civil lawsuit against Miss Morrison personally for trespassing, property damage, and harassment, and against the HOA for violation of property rights and breach of fiduciary duty. Additionally, I'm filing complaints with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOA operations in this state. Linda's face had gone from pale to bright red. You can't sue the HOA. That's using HOA funds to sue yourself. Actually, I'm suing you personally and the HOA as separate entities. The HOA's insurance will cover the association's defense, but your personal actions in trespassing and property damage, those are on you, Miss Morrison. Steve Harrison cleared his throat. Linda, I've been telling you for months that you're overstepping. I move that we rescind all fines against Mr. Matthews immediately and issue a formal apology. Seconded, someone called from the audience. That's not how this works, Linda sputtered. You can't just make motions from the floor. This has to go through proper channels. Actually, according to your own bylaws, any board member can make a motion, and any resident in good standing can second it at an open meeting, Robert said. I've read your governing documents quite thoroughly. Steve looked emboldened. All in favor of rescinding the fines against Mr. Matthews? Aye, Steve said loudly, silence from Linda, Barbara, and Susan. The motion fails, Linda said triumphantly. Robert smiled. That's fine. The judge will rescind them anyway when we win our lawsuit. But I want it on record that reasonable options were presented and rejected. Now, I'd like to address another matter. I represent 7 additional homeowners in this community who have been subjected to similar harassment, improper fines, and violations of their property rights. We're prepared to file a class action lawsuit if these matters aren't resolved immediately. Patricia Ferguson stood up. I'm one of those homeowners. Linda Morrison has made living in this neighborhood miserable for everyone. She fined us $500 because our Christmas lights were still up on December 28th. The covenant says holiday decorations must be down by mid-January. She made up her own deadline and fined us for violating a rule that doesn't exist. Tom Anderson stood next. She fined me $1,000 because my daughter's birthday balloons were visible from the street. There's no rule against balloons. One by one, residents stood up and shared their stories. Linda's face grew darker with each testimony. Finally, she banged her gavel so hard it cracked. "This meeting is over," she shouted. "Everyone out. Board members, we need an executive session immediately." "You can't call an executive session without proper notice and a valid reason," Robert said calmly. "Personnel matters, legal advice, or contract negotiations. Silencing residents doesn't qualify. If you end this meeting prematurely, that's another violation we'll add to our complaint." Linda looked like she might actually explode. She gathered up her papers with shaking hands and stormed out of the community center, Barbara and Susan scurrying after her. Steve Harrison remained seated, looking shell-shocked. The room burst into conversation. Several residents came up to shake my hand and thank me for finally standing up to Linda. Robert handed out business cards to anyone interested in joining the lawsuit. As we walked to our cars afterward, Robert seemed pleased. "That went even better than I expected. The more she tries to flex her authority, the worse she makes her position. And having all those residents publicly testify to her pattern of harassment, that's gold for our case. What happens now?" I asked. "I'll file the lawsuit tomorrow. The police will continue their investigation into the trespassing and property damage. And I expect Linda Morrison will make at least one more critical mistake before this is over. People like her can't help themselves." He was right. 3 days later, I came home from work to find a construction crew in my backyard. They were in the process of tearing down my propane shed with a small excavator. I ran out screaming. "Stop! What the hell are you doing?" The crew foreman, a burly guy in a hard hat, looked confused. "HOA hired us to remove an unpermitted structure. We got a work order and everything." "Let me see it." He showed me a document on his clipboard. It was on HOA letterhead, signed by Linda Morrison, authorizing removal of the illegal structure at my address and billing the cost to my account. "This isn't authorized," I said, pulling out my phone. "I'm calling the police right now. You need to stop immediately." "Look, buddy, we're just doing the job we were hired for," the foreman said, but he signaled his crew to stop. "But I'm not leaving until I get paid for my time. Someone's going to pay for the half-day." I called 911 first, then Robert Chen. The police arrived within 15 minutes, a different officer this time, a younger woman named Officer Lisa Rodriguez. I showed her the work order and explained the situation. She examined the document and shook her head. "This is going to be tough because technically, the HOA did authorize it. But given the ongoing legal dispute and the fact that there's already a criminal investigation open against Miss Morrison for trespassing on this same property, this looks like continued harassment and potentially destruction of property." Robert arrived shortly after, took one look at the partially dismantled shed, and his calm demeanor finally cracked into visible anger. "This is destruction of property. This is retaliation. This is witness intimidation. Linda Morrison just escalated this from a civil dispute to potential criminal charges." The foreman was looking increasingly nervous. "Look, I don't want any trouble. The lady paid us half upfront and promised the other half when the job was done. We'll put everything back if that's what you want, but someone's got to pay us." "Send your bill to Linda Morrison," Robert said. "And consider yourself lucky you're not being charged as an accessory to property destruction. Do you have the contract you signed with her?" The foreman pulled it out. Robert photographed every page. "Mr. Matthews will be suing Miss Morrison for the cost of repairs, and this contract proves she ordered the destruction. Officer Rodriguez, I strongly recommend upgrading the charges against Miss Morrison to include destruction of property and harassment." Officer Rodriguez nodded and made notes. After she left, Robert and I surveyed the damage. The excavator had torn off one entire wall of the shed and damaged the roof. My propane tanks were still intact, thankfully, but the structure was essentially destroyed. "How much to fix this?" Robert asked. I did some mental calculations. Complete rebuild, probably $4,000 in materials and labor. I built it myself the first time, but I don't have time to do it again right away. We're going to add that to the lawsuit along with punitive damages. What Miss Morrison did today is beyond the pale. She's going to lose everything over this. That evening, I sat in my house feeling violated and angry. It wasn't even about the money anymore. It was the principle of the thing. Linda Morrison thought she could do whatever she wanted because she had a title and some perceived authority. She'd trespassed, broken into my property, destroyed my belongings, and faced no immediate consequences until now. But that was about to change. The next week moved quickly. Robert filed an emergency restraining order against Linda Morrison, barring her from my property or contacting me directly. The judge granted it immediately given the video evidence, police reports, and now the destruction of my shed. Robert also filed an amended lawsuit adding the destruction of property and significantly increasing the damages we were seeking. The HOA's insurance company got involved and sent their own lawyer to assess the situation. After reviewing everything, they sent Linda a letter informing her that her actions were not covered under the HOA's liability policy because she'd acted criminally and outside the scope of her authority. She was on her own for legal defense. Meanwhile, the class action lawsuit gained momentum. By the end of the second week, we had 15 homeowners signed on, each with their own horror story about Linda's reign as HOA president. Robert compiled everything into a massive filing that detailed a pattern of harassment, illegal fines, and abuse of authority spanning her entire 6-month tenure. The breaking point came at the next scheduled HOA board meeting. This time, Robert filed a motion with the court to have a special meeting called for the purpose of removing Linda Morrison from the board. Arizona law allowed for removal of board members by a majority vote of homeowners in cases of misconduct. The special meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after Linda had broken into my shed. The community center was packed with over 100 residents, far more than I'd ever seen at an HOA meeting. The tension in the room was palpable. Linda sat at the board table looking defiant but exhausted. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her usual perfect hair and makeup were slightly disheveled. Barbara Klein and Susan Wright sat with her, but they kept whispering to each other nervously. Steve Harrison sat on the opposite end of the table, clearly separate from the other three. Robert stood and addressed the room. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here tonight because the HOA board president has engaged in a sustained campaign of harassment, filed illegal fines, trespassed on private property, destroyed private property, and generally violated the trust of every homeowner in this community. Under Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33-1813, homeowners have the right to remove a board member for cause by majority vote. Tonight, we're exercising that right." "This is a witch hunt," Linda said, her voice cracking slightly. "I've only ever tried to maintain property values and uphold our community standards." "You broke into my shed with a crowbar," I said, standing up. "Then you sent a construction crew to destroy it when you couldn't win legally. That's not maintaining standards. That's criminal behavior." "I had the authority," Linda insisted, but there was no conviction in her voice anymore. Steve Harrison cleared his throat. "Linda, I tried to warn you. Multiple times. You've gone way too far and you've exposed the HOA to massive liability. As the only other board member who wasn't appointed by you, I'm formally supporting this removal action." Robert called for the vote. Of the 112 homeowners present or represented by proxy, 97 voted to remove Linda Morrison from the board. 8 voted against and 7 abstained. It was a landslide. Linda stood up, tears now streaming down her face, her carefully constructed authority completely shattered. "You people have no idea what you're doing. This neighborhood will fall apart without proper leadership. Property values will plummet. You'll regret this." "The only thing we regret is letting you bully us for 6 months, Patricia Ferguson called out. Linda grabbed her purse and walked out of the community center for the last time as HOA president. Barbara Klein and Susan Wright quickly followed, both clearly wanting to distance themselves from the disaster. The meeting continued with Steve Harrison as temporary president. The first order of business was rescinding every fine Linda had imposed in her tenure. The second was hiring an independent management company to handle day-to-day HOA operations, so no single person could ever have that much power again. The third was formally apologizing to every homeowner who'd been harassed. As the meeting wrapped up, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I hadn't even realized I'd been carrying. It wasn't over yet legally. The criminal charges and civil lawsuit were still pending, but the immediate threat was gone. The criminal case moved forward over the next 2 months. The Scottsdale prosecutor, a sharp woman named Jennifer Walsh, took the case seriously. She'd apparently dealt with HOA disputes before and had little patience for board members who thought they were above the law. Linda Morrison was charged with criminal trespassing, criminal damage, and harassment. Her lawyer tried to argue that she'd been acting in her official capacity and made a judgment error, but the video evidence and the subsequent destruction of my shed undermined any claim of good faith. The trial was quick. The jury took less than 2 hours to find her guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 6 months in jail, suspended on the condition of 2 years probation, 200 hours of community service, and full restitution for all damages. She was also ordered to pay my attorney's fees, which had climbed to nearly $20,000. The civil lawsuit settled shortly after the criminal conviction. Linda's homeowner's insurance wouldn't cover intentional acts, so she was personally on the hook. She ended up settling for $75,000 to be split among all the plaintiffs in the class action. My portion, given that I'd suffered the most direct damage, was $25,000, more than enough to rebuild my shed 3 times over and compensate me for the months of stress. The HOA itself also settled, agreeing to reform its governing procedures, implement oversight mechanisms, and pay for a professional management company for at least 3 years. The remaining board members, Barbara Klein and Susan Wright, resigned in shame. New elections were held, and a slate of reasonable people who actually cared about the community, rather than wielding power, took over. Linda Morrison and her husband quietly sold their house and moved away 3 months after the trial. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that they'd relocated to some rural area in Nevada where there was no HOA at all. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. I rebuilt my propane shed, this time even bigger and nicer than before. I made sure every single permit was visible on the wall inside, along with a printed copy of the architectural guidelines highlighting the sections that proved my compliance. I also installed security cameras covering every angle of my property. Not because I thought Linda would be back, but because the experience had taught me that it's better to have evidence and not need it than need evidence and not have it. The Saguaro Heights subdivision slowly returned to normal. The professional management company turned out to be fantastic, handling routine maintenance and violations, actual violations, not made-up ones, with efficiency and fairness. Board meetings became boring affairs about landscaping contracts and pool maintenance schedules. It was exactly what an HOA should be. One Saturday afternoon, about 6 months after everything concluded, I was grilling steaks on my back porch when Donald and Patricia Ferguson stopped by with a bottle of wine. "We just wanted to thank you again," Patricia said as we sat on my patio furniture. "If you hadn't stood up to Linda and documented everything, she'd probably still be terrorizing the neighborhood." "I just did what anyone should do when someone breaks into their property," I said, flipping a wry eye. "No," Donald said seriously. "Most people would have backed down. The HOA has power, legal resources, and can make your life miserable. Fighting back takes courage and commitment. You could have just paid the fines and moved on." "I thought about it," I admitted, "but it wasn't right." And once I realized I wasn't the only one she was targeting, I knew someone had to stop her. We ate dinner and talked about normal things, upcoming neighborhood events, the new pool furniture the HOA was installing, someone's daughter getting into Arizona State University. It felt remarkably normal and peaceful. Later that night, I stood in my backyard looking at my rebuilt propane shed illuminated by the security lights. It was just a shed, a simple structure to store some propane tanks and lawn equipment. But it had become a symbol of something more important: standing up for your rights, documenting everything, and not letting bullies win just because they have a title. My phone buzzed with an email from Robert Chen. He'd sent a final accounting of the case and all the settlements. Everything was concluded, all checks had cleared, all legal obligations satisfied. At the bottom, he'd written a personal note. "Lucas, it was a pleasure working with you. You did everything right from the start: documentation, staying calm, following proper procedures. If more people handled disputes this way, I'd have a lot less work, but I'm glad you were willing to fight. Take care." I smiled and put my phone away. The whole experience had been exhausting, infuriating, and expensive even with the settlement, but it had also been necessary. Linda Morrison had learned that breaking the law had consequences, no matter what authority she thought she had. The neighborhood had learned that they didn't have to accept abuse from HOA board members. And I'd learned that standing up for yourself, even when it's hard, is always worth it. The Arizona night was cool and clear, stars visible despite the city lights. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. Life in Scottsdale continued, peaceful and normal, exactly as it should be. My propane shed stood secure and properly permitted, a monument to property rights and the rule of law. I went inside, locked my doors, and went to bed knowing that tomorrow would be another ordinary day. No HOA drama, no lawyers, no court appearances. Just work, home, maybe grilling another steak on the weekend. The nightmare was over, and the only thing Linda Morrison had succeeded in doing was proving that even HOA presidents have to follow the law. The video evidence had been damning, the legal case straightforward, and justice had been served. Sometimes, the system actually works when you have documentation, determination, and a good lawyer. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about all the homeowners in America dealing with overzealous HOA board members. My advice would be simple. Document everything, know your rights, read your covenants and bylaws, and never be afraid to stand up to bullies even when they have authority. Because authority without accountability is just tyranny on a small scale. The shed incident had taught me that lesson the hard way, but it was a lesson worth learning. And hopefully, somewhere out there, Another homeowner facing similar harassment would hear this story and find the courage to fight back too. In the end, Linda Morrison's legacy in Sagaro Heights wasn't the maintained property values she'd claimed to champion. It was a cautionary tale about what happens when power goes unchecked and someone finally says enough. The criminal record, the lawsuit losses, the forced resignation, and the humiliating departure were all consequences of her own actions. The propane shed still stood in my backyard, rebuilt and better than ever. And every time I looked at it, I smiled knowing that it represented more than just storage. It represented the right to be secure in your property, the importance of standing up for yourself, and the eventual triumph of justice over petty tyranny. That was worth more than any settlement check, though the money certainly helped cover the costs. Life went on in Scottsdale. HOA meetings became boring again, and I never had to deal with Linda Morrison's harassment anymore. Sometimes, happy endings do happen, especially when you're willing to fight for them with evidence, persistence, and the law on your side.